Hi, I'm Elizabeth Tabish. I play Mary Magdalene in The Chosen. Dive deeper into the series and follow The Chosen on Hope Media Podcasts and on the Hope 1032 YouTube channel.
This is the final episode of season 4. And Laura, can I go first?
Sure you can.
Loved it. Loved it.
Did
Loved
you?
it. After last episode, episode 7, where you quite rightly made a lot of good points about why I was, let's just say politely, wrong. Number 8, I'm back. Episode 8, I'm back.
Let's get into episode 8. Why did you like it?
Oh my goodness. All the things that I was going on about a little bit last time that I didn't really like. This one, beautiful. I loved how this tapestry just formed at the end of season 4. And I really liked how they picked not ending on Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem. It's just before. It's like an anticlimax finale. No. But I thought that's a great choice because usually they've had this massive set piece. Let's finish on the Sermon on the Mount or Peter walking on water, all these kind of big things. Okay, fair enough. This is big, this moment for Jesus, huge. But they didn't actually end on it.
No, because I recognize...
What now?
My opinion is different from yours.
Really?
Because I recognize that there is significance, of course, in the moment they ended on. But as far as a TV show goes, as far as an episode goes, I thought this was such a flop of an ending. Because
Laura.
you've dropped something in at the end that we already know, like from a
But we know all of this, Laura.
I know, but the thing is, The Chosen have a great way of taking a story that we know and still making it suspenseful, still making it something that we're finding new ideas in and all of that. I found with this, I'm like, I know. They ended it in a way that didn't leave me feeling any kind of suspense or anything like that, because we know what's coming next in this story and they just sort of let you know they know too, and it's about to get there at some point soon. It just didn't have the climactic finish that I was wanting from a season finale point of view. But obviously, as we've said, it's a significant moment in Jesus' life and story. Do not deny that. Just don't think it was effective as a finale.
That's putting it mildly, a significant moment in Jesus' journey. We'd love to hear from you, as we were hearing from you, particularly on the last episode. Hit us with your comments on the YouTube video, wherever you're getting the podcast, because Laura, at episode 7, where you were way more in defense of it than I was, someone else, they call themselves someone else, writing a comment saying they didn't think the storyline was a distraction at all. Also agreeing that, yes, I can't be pleased, says Kent. Thank you very much, Kent. User ZH3PU, etc., basically sums it up by saying Laura is spot on.
Oh, look at that. Thank you to Z, all the other letters. Really appreciate it.
Those 4 words summed up the huge comment thread that was on the bottom of the last episode. Thank you. Let us know what you think about episode 8, and this time how you think I'm right and how Laura is incorrect, because I take your point about it being something of a, flatter ending to a season, but it's also a season within multiple seasons, and I don't think it's a reasonable expectation. Sorry, I should back that up. Personally, I don't think it's a reasonable expectation to expect every TV show ever to end on something hugely climactic. I don't think that's necessary, and I think there is suspense left in Jesus being on the threshold of what we know is the final week of his life. That is super important. And I like the restraint that The Chosen showed on. We don't have to go out with fireworks or something enormous. The enormity of the situation is there, and not just implicit. Like, if you know anything about what happens to Jesus now, it's enormous. I don't know how they're going to fill 3 seasons, because they've talked about making 7 seasons of The Chosen. I don't know how you can do 3 seasons on 1 week in Jesus' life, but hey, I'm up for it. But for me, Laura, the main part of the episode was this awesome central scene around a table with Jesus interacting with some of the religious leaders we keep seeing on and off throughout the show. But what Mary does with Jesus, Mary or Martha? Mary. It's Mary, right?
Are you talking about the perfume?
Yeah. And I had to go back to my Bible to work out that it was actually Mary that anointed Jesus' feet with that super expensive perfume. Like, I'd always thought that was some other lady who was unknown. And thank you, Chosen, for driving me back to my Bible to I got to go fact check this. And that's right. I love how The Chosen picks up on something I've read in the Bible. Never really noticed that this is actually linked to Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. And it's such a critical recognition of who Jesus is in a small but enormous way. And I thought The Chosen did it incredible justice in this final episode. Here ends my sermon.
I like parts of your sermon because maybe parts, right? No, definite bits of this episode that I thought had weak points, but I agree that there is definitely strength to the way they represented the passage of scripture that we know about this woman, Mary, as you say, bringing that perfume and not just using a little bit on Jesus, but using all of it, and how significant that was. Because when we think about that passage of scripture, we do often look at it through a lens of sacrifice and how much you give and what's in your hand, and this lavishness of the way that love for Jesus can be demonstrated and how that may be judged by others. But in the way it's represented in this episode, they really do focus on just how controversial it could have been, this manner of demonstration. And then also to your point of the exchange that happens around that, I really enjoyed what it did within that group, because as Jesus is again talking about, these parts of scripture that we've heard so much, yet they bring new lenses to in this episode, he's talking about what you do for the least of these, you do for me, and that whole famous kind of passage. And
didn't you like those? Sorry to cut you off, but didn't you like
okay.
the build up to him even sharing that? And there's a really good exchange using a bunch of different passages, again, that most of us are very familiar with, but The Chosen does a great job of combining them together, of Jewish religious leaders talking about what it means to follow God. And they quote from Ecclesiastes about fearing God and keeping his commands. And Jesus says, yeah, that's right. But you've also overlooked other parts of the prophets that we find in the Old Testament that talk about love and justice and mercy. And Jesus then gives the new command to love others as I have loved you, and then heads into what you do for the least of these, you do for me. And for me, that was an excellent moment of screenwriting, of you bringing together quite almost far-flung passages across an enormous book that has a lot of weight, and you have an understanding of how these come together, and then you present them like this in a conversation with people who on one hand are actually trying to do the same thing. They're trying to love God and they're trying to serve God, but here is Jesus saying, I can hear you, I can appreciate that, however you're not quite getting it and you're overlooking some things. And then that heads nicely into him sharing about looking out for the poor, looking out for the least of these.
And with that, I think what this episode, it points to something that I think this episode actually does really well, touching on conversations.
See, I told you.
No, I was going to come around to liking some of it. No, but what I actually did like about this episode is how it uses these exchanges to really point to some very relevant issues we have even in this day and age. So the way that scripture comes out in that scene, it's a wrestle for some people in that room to think about how Jesus treats the least of these. And that now is something that causes so much friction within certain Christian communities. Who are the least of these, and how can you let that person in, and how can you push that person out? And hang on a minute, I don't think this is what Jesus meant by this particular passage. People debate like that even now. That's what I liked about that scene, is that it sparked this conversation of the things we wrestle with about the way Jesus treats certain people and invites us to treat people, and we've got to make a choice. Is that going to be a stumbling block? Is that kind of openness going to be something that we come against, or is it going to be something that we see as something to embrace?
And also, and that scene, and for me, it's the best scene in the whole episode, of which I loved. Have I made that clear? I really love this finale. What I really liked about it is, and you can have these conversations now, you're right, about these things that Jesus said, these things that are revealed in the Bible, and are you going to go with them or not? And not just are you going to reject them flat out, but how can you bring them all together? And it showed very vividly that even when it's from the mouth of Jesus and it's alongside other things in scripture, it can be really difficult to put them all together. And here's a moment where there's something very expensive, something that money could have been, there's other things that money could have been spent on, including the things that Jesus talks about and advocates for, and God has been on about for a long time. And Judas understandably comes into this episode at this and other moments, but particularly at this moment, and stands up quite well for, hang on, this doesn't make sense. Like, why would you sit back and allow this to happen when you've said and God said all this other stuff? How does this possibly compute? It seems the reaction of Judas is it doesn't compute, and maybe others in the room is the same way. But Jesus, I love this about The Chosen, they have him holding his ground and just saying, he doesn't say this in words, but like the vibe is it does. Like you've actually got to then try to work out how it does. Like how does all of this synthesize together? Just as he's given a new command to love others. Like, how can you even give a new command? And is that new command meant to summarize everything?
Yeah.
Or is it in addition to? So I really, really felt that. Whereas last episode, you were talking a lot about some of the reaction you had to the episode. This one, I was like invested. And I'm like, I'm at that dinner party, man. I'm like, I'm right there. I'm all into it. And then they head towards the big finale, which wasn't that big. And I was still there, Laura.
It was just like, I was like, all right, okay, cool. We're just going to like pop that there. It's, to me, they just flattened it right at the end. But I like something Judas did in this episode too, that want to touch on that before touching on something else that happened earlier in the episode we haven't mentioned. But I like what Judas did after that scene where you've got Yusuf and he walks out and he's, forget you, Jesus, you've ruined the chance I was going to give you. And as a group, the disciples agree, well, we might have annoyed the wrong person. That's somebody that you want on side if we're going to try to have unity. And Judas, this was one of his stronger episodes, I think, actually. He has this chat along the lines of, we may disagree on this, but we need unity. So what are we going to do to get to unity? How do we find that pathway forward? And that was another moment that really spoke to the modern relevance of what they're doing with The Chosen, because I think we see that happen where whether you're people who share a Christian faith or not, or you're just somebody else who wants good in the world but isn't quite sure about the faith conversation, so many of us have really shared objectives we want to get to, people living healthy, purpose-filled lives, all of that. We want unity along the way, but we can have such division about how we get there and squabble over the details. That scene, that exchange just spoke about that to me, where it was like, if unity is our objective, what do we need to do to get to that end goal, and how much of the details in between really matter? I really quite like that they touched on that, which then comes back to something at the beginning of the episode where you've got the governor chatting with one of his advisors. There's a part of their exchange where the advisor says that he's seeing things he can't explain, but he hasn't decided whether it matters or not yet. And the governor says, the concern is not so much whether people think something is true, but whether they believe it's true. Like, it doesn't matter necessarily if what Jesus is doing is true or not true. Their concern is if people believe it to be true, what's that going to do? And that again speaks to a question that I think we all ask and have to ask. In all of our lives, there's things we see that we do not comprehend, like these unexplainable things that often do sit in this space of faith. And all of us have to decide, do we or do we not believe? Whether it's about Jesus, whether it's about God, but then also, does it matter? Like, if we can't explain something, does that question of, is this God, is this not God, does that matter? And what's the impact or outcome going to be if we say yes or no? Which I don't want to not mention that as we talk about this episode, because I thought that was a really important part.
Sounds to me like you love this episode, Laura. You're really coming back onto the side of that was a great finale to season 4.
It started strong. It had strong bits in the middle. The end, no.
Yes, that's a yes from me on the finale of season 4. They got me back in this one, Laura, and we'll be back for season 5 of I was going to say following The Chosen. We'll be back for the next season of Following The Chosen, following season 5 of The Chosen. Love to hear from you, all your thoughts, your feelings, opinions, particularly about how I'm right about this episode, or any
or how
other
he's wrong,
or any other episode for that matter. Also, Laura, all your Chosen interviews are at the Hope 1032 YouTube channel, and if you haven't checked them out already, you have no excuse. So now you need to go right now and have a look at them, because by my last count, there's about 1 million.
There's a lot.
There's a lot.
There may not be 1 million episodes, but there's certainly 1 million comments that we want you to engage in and be part of. It's a great discussion.
And we know how much you love The Chosen, so you will love getting into that. We've loved bringing you Following The Chosen, and we'll be back for next season. See you then.
The struggle is real. I say the struggle reveals how you deal with the monster that's inside.